Welcome back to Old Testament literature. This week we're going to be talking about what is Hebrew poetry. And really, the best way to talk about poetry is to contrast it with prose or narrative. You don't really know poetry if you don't know narrative first in any language, because by definition, poetry is the condensed version of what you would expect. So once you learn the normal rules to grammar and syntax, poetry is something that varies those rules according to its own set of rules, kind of within that realm of language, in order to produce something that's much more emotive and much more terse and much more flowing, or as we would say, to kind of spur people to emotion and thought at a deeper level than normal narrative will do. So ultimately, you can view prose and poetry as being on the same spectrum. If you think of like this diagram I have here on the page, prose is going to be something that uses more sentences and paragraphs, and it's going to sound more like ordinary speech or writing that you would normally hear people talk through all of the time. And it may or may not be creative. It's not as if it can't have a punchline or it can't be emotive. It just generally is going to be take a long time to get there. Versus poetry is going to be more of something that's in lines and stanzas, and it's going to be kind of special and try to get to the sort of artistic part and the emotive part much more quickly or in a much more condensed manner. And when you think about poetry and prose, or narrative in poetry, or prose and verse, those are all kind of relative synonyms. You can think about figuration and stylization having either more or less. So normally, poetry is going to have more figurization and more stylization, and in the sense of how it goes about actually trying to craft thoughts and meaning. And you can even talk about it this way: prose is normally going to get straight to the referent, so you don't have to normally guess if it's talking about a dog, as a quick example. Versus in poetry, you might say all of these other things as four-legged creature. Um, and especially in English poetry, you'd find something that would rhyme with creature if you ended the sentence with that, but that's not the case in every form of poetry. But you might say all these other things to try to get you to the dog so that someone can at some point go, okay, they're talking about the dog in a more stylistic way. So the table I have here in front of you is going to contrast the elements that Longman talks about when it comes to prose and what he talks about when it comes to poetry. So let's just review the last chapter. So for prose, he's going to say it's got something related to focalization, and it's the same thing as talking about point of view. It's either first, second, or third. Then you've always going to have a plot, a clear plot, in his opinion, that has a beginning, middle, and end. You're going to have characterization, where you're trying to develop characters, talk about characters, having flat characters in some cases, but overall trying to talk about some sort of character development. But in scripture, remember, you're not going to always describe the characters. You're just going to just kind of have the characters do actions and speeches that help you develop their character. Then you're going to have a clear setting. It's always going to talk about locations and all of that. Even if it's sparse on the details, it's going to tell you where these things are taking place. You're going to have some sort of temporal element to it, and then it's going to be in speeches and paragraphs. And then, like we talked about in the last chapter, the dialogue is going to drive the motivations or the thoughts of the individual characters as they interact with each other. This is not the case in poetry. Once again, poetry is going to be much more terse. It's going to have less conjunctions, articles, direct object markers. Then it's going to have what is known as parallelism, which can take at least three forms, probably more than that, which we'll talk about here in a moment. And then you'll have figurative language. Um, is more increased. Metaphors are used more frequently. Things like refrain, inclusio, merisms, chiasms, though once again you can find those in Hebrew narrative. They just don't appear as frequently according to Longman. Then you'll have more acrostics and sound plays. Once again, acrostics are going to be unique to poetry as far as we can tell in the Hebrew Bible, but sound plays you'll have both, and that's just where you're kind of playing on the words that are kind of put together, putting them together, make them sound the same, and or as sort of like a word play would fall into that category as well. And then once again, you're going to have cola, bicola, and stanzas for poetry in the way in which it's written. So now, I've said this a little, but I just want to clarify. It's not as if you can't have terseness in prose or that you can't have a character in poetry. However, generally speaking, if you have characters and they're being described and they have these sort of important dialogues that are kind of describing the things going on in their heart or the actions that they're going to do, you can be more assured that you're reading prose in the Hebrew Bible compared to if you don't have a clear character and you just have some sort of this figurative language and metaphors and inclusios and things being repeated over and over again, and you don't have the conjunctions and articles, especially in Hebrew, then you can be sure that you're probably reading poetry. Once again, it's a spectrum between those. So Longman goes into more detail on what is known as parallelism, and this is a term derived from geometry, meaning things that parallel each other or things that kind of match up each other in lines of poetry or cola of poetry. And Longman's going to look at this at three levels. So the first is going to be semantic, and the second is going to be syntactical. And semantic and syntactical are going to kind of function together in Longman's view. So semantics is going to be like words being similar. So you might have two synonyms. So you might say something like, I really like this tree. In fact, I love this tree. Well, like and love are kind of in the same semantic range. And syntactical is going to have to do more with like the structure of the parallel. So you might have, and this is just one example, 3 lines or 3 words in the first part of the poem, 3 words in the next part of the poem, or roughly they're just both talking about the same thing syntactically, or they're using the same verb. So you might say, I love apples and not bananas. Well, from that sentence and that line of poetry, if you want to call it that, you assume that the word love is in the second part, even though it's not there. So I love apples and not bananas. Well, you can fill in, and I don't love bananas. So I'm trying to be terse to make it more poetic. So that's semantic and syntactical parallelism. And then Longman is also going to look at phonological or grammatical parallelism, is when you have the 2 words that are kind of being used in both cola. So you might have, once again, I love bananas and I love apples. That would be something that would be more on a phonological level. So the basic thing here is that parallelism can function on 3 different levels as a kind of basic introduction to it. And once again, Longman goes through plenty of examples in his chapter. All right, and once again, Longman goes through a lot of examples. I'll just walk you through this one here in Psalm 1, which is, obviously a famous psalm that many people memorize and all of that, and spend a lot of time in. So let me just talk you through this kind of cola by cola or line by line. So you've got your introduction here. This is it in Hebrew. This is it in English. The man is blessed who. And then you get from there 4 words each in each line. So once again, in English, it's not 4 words, and I could have tried to match that in my translation. But in Hebrew, it definitely is. So I just want to show you here. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4 words in each line there, in each cola, to kind of make each of them match. And this would be an example of inverted parallelism, because you have in Hebrew the verb here. So lo halak, do not walk. So that's the English equivalent. And then you have lo amad, do not stand. equivalent in English, and lo yashav, do not sit. He does not sit. And it's inverted because you had that start off here at the beginning of the cola, and then it switches to the end of the cola for the other two lines there. So that's why that would be an example of inverted parallelism or an inverted structure of Hebrew poetry. So then you have here an anacrusis, which is just kind of like an introduction to a section. So that's why I've separated that. You've got another one here, all kin in Hebrew, another anacrusis because of this. And so that's just something that introduces a phrase or statement that's about to come into play in a poetic line. And then the most common form of parallelism occurs here, synonymous parallelism. And I want to nuance this in the same way Longman does here in a second. So you have in this line in English, and the Torah of Yahweh, or the Lord, Torah of the Lord, however you want to translate that, is his delight. And in his Torah, he delights day and night. So in a sense, especially on a surface level, it's saying the same thing on both lines. It's God's Torah, and the man delights in this. But as Longman's going to point out, its parallelism, especially synonymous parallelism, really works in the form of A, what's more B, meaning A is said, so let me put an A here, and then B comes in and it says something else about A and clarifies it. So you have, yes, and his Torah is his delight, but then it kind of takes it further to say, it's not just his delight. It's not like he just finds some time to do it. No, this is like his consuming delight. This is something he does all of the time. Any chance that he gets, he's trying to do this. He's trying to focus on God's word, trying to meditate on God's Torah day and night, every opportunity that he gets. And then day and night would also be an example of a merism here. Yom Valila, day and night, as often as this person can. So then from here, I'll go into line 3. This would be an example of climactic parallelism, because it's building up to something. And so I tried to do my best in my English translation to show that, and I tried to structure the Hebrew kind of that way as well. You could say maybe it's staircasing. It would be similar to climactic, however you'd want to go about it. And so the point here being is, okay, you start off the line with, he would be a tree planted upon streams of water, therefore his fruit, and then it kind of goes from there. He will produce in his time. Also, his leaves will not wither. Also, everything he does will prosper. So each time is getting further and further and explaining more and more about what this person who meditates on God's Torah is going to be able to do. And once again, because line 4 is doing the same thing, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. It's also climactic. It's just saying, okay, it's not going to be this case for the wicked. The wind drives them away. And then you get another example of synonymous parallelism. And lastly, in verse 6, you have the other major type of parallelism, antithesis or contrasting lines. So you've got here in verse 6, which I had to make it small to kind of make it fit here in my English translation, for Yahweh or the Lord knows the manner of the righteous, but the manner of the wicked perishes. So those two ideas contrast, and the point here being, like Longman points out, is trying to get at the same thing from two different perspectives. So it's trying to say that God knows the righteous, which also means he knows that the wicked are going to perish. Or you could say God knows the wicked is going to perish, which means he also knows that the righteous are going to prosper. It's two different sides of the same coin to try to say the same thing, just in contrastive ways. Now, it's worth pointing out here that there is no rhyme in Hebrew poetry. So it's not like you're trying to say, that you're trying to say something like, does not walk in the counsel of the wicked. Um, Come on, let's get with it, or something like that to rhyme with wicked. It's like wicked and then the word stand. They don't rhyme in English and they don't rhyme in Hebrew either. So once again, I just want to clarify that because I know I gave the English example. This word here, Rashaim, does not rhyme with Ahmad. They're not even close in Hebrew. And so there's no intent to do that. And Longman does make a good observation, is there's no point in trying to make something rhyme with the way that Hebrew is written. It wouldn't really benefit the language if you were trying to make the words rhyme. So once again, I know this is an English-based class, but if Rashim and Hataim and Lasim, those all rhyme, but they all rhyme because they have, in a sense, this eem ending, which is very common in Hebrew. And so Longman's point is, because you have words that all kind of end in certain endings much more frequently than we do in English or in another language where you might want to rhyme, there really wouldn't have been anything creative about making words rhyme, especially not their endings to rhyme in Hebrew. So therefore, that's his logic behind why there just would not have been this desire to want their poetic verse to actually have rhymed that way. So we'll end this with another Riken activity, and we're going to talk about comedy. So I'm not really sure why, because I'm not a literary scholar, though I do analyze the Bible from a literary perspective, why they haven't picked a different term for this, but they call comedy this sort of structure that's U-shaped, that starts with prosperity, descends into tragedy, and then rises again with a happy ending. That is what is known as comedy in literary studies. And so this is going to have a few main elements. It's going to have obstacles that have to be overcome to achieve this happy ending. It's going to have a protagonist that assimilates into society. So if they were kind of on the outskirts of society, they end up being a part of society at the end in the happy ending. It's going to have endings that revolve around a sort of marriage or a feast or reconciliation or triumph over the enemies. And they're going to have literary themes of hit and miss, surprise, and poetic justice, so on and so forth. And so as I was, putting this together, my first thoughts in this description is the book of Esther. The book of Esther does have a lot of these elements, and so you're going to see a lot of scholars kind of refer to it in this sort of comic fashion, and they don't mean it's laughable or that it's trying to make someone laugh, or even that it's a false story in all cases, though there are a lot of scholars that believe that about the book of Esther. I'm not one of them, but a lot of people do. Their point is just that it follows this sort of U-shaped. It starts off with Esther and Mordecai, in a sense, living very prosperous. They seem to be fine in the nation. The nation is prospering because King Ahasuerus, which is the name in Hebrew, Xerxes in English, has the nation set up to be really successful and prosperous. But then when Haman shows up and has this issue with Mordecai, it kind of descends into this tragedy where all of the Judeans who are living there at the moment are going to die. And so then Esther has to act. She has to go before the king. He lowers his scepter. And after they have this ability to retaliate, there's this sort of happy ending, right? Mordecai gets raised into the second in command. Esther, continues to be the queen. There's this Purim that's celebrated. There's also that theme of hiddeness throughout, where Esther does not reveal herself to all people that she is a Judean, and so on and so forth. So it seems to fit a lot of these elements. So therefore, a lot of scholars would view the book of Esther, the book of Esther as a comedy.